PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Prior to 2020, this was often associated with veterans returning home from war, police, firefighters, frontline medical personnel, and other first responders, and those who suffered abuse as children. With the advent of the unprecedented events of 2020, this list has expanded. Treatment with various types of counseling and therapy have helped, but there are those who do not respond and continue to suffer. Is there any answer for them? My guest this week on Destination Unlimited, Dr. Eugene Lipov, has pioneered a treatment that has been highly effective in treating chronic PTSD. The treatment, Stellate Ganglion block, is a 5-minute procedure that can help bring the brain back to its unstuck state, relieving 80% of patients from trauma symptoms and opening up the opportunity for long-term healing. Dr. Lipov was born in the Soviet-controlled Ukraine, and his family emigrated to the United States in 1973. Coming from a family of physicians, he trained in biology and medicine and ultimately specialized in advanced pain management. Dr. Lipov is a board-certified physician in anesthesiology and pain management. He's been practicing in the field of pain medicine since 1990. He's the chief medical officer of the Stellate Center and joins us this week to share his path and work. Please join me in welcoming to Destination Unlimited Dr. Eugene Lipov. Welcome, Dr. Lipov.
Thank you for having me, sir.
And thank you for joining us. So please share with us your early life and what it was like growing up in the Ukraine under Soviet rule.
Well, I was born in Ukraine and I lived there till I was 6 years old, so I don't have that many memories. I do have one interesting one, which is kind of, I think, unique. So the place where I was born, Cherkasy, was one of the sites of a huge tank battle between Germany and Russia, or Soviet Union. And then, so one of our friends found an unexploded shell, and then they were playing with it. They hit it against the rock. Fortunately, I wasn't there with my brother, but they both lost limbs from that explosion. So I was about 4 years old then. Besides that, that was kind of a very odd thing to occur. But I was 6 years old, so when I left, I really don't quite remember much about Ukraine.
And what prompted your family to come to the United States?
Anti-Semitism. They had a lot of difficulty finding jobs because on your passport said what your nationality is. There it's defined as nationality. And then they really had a lot of problems because of that. And my parents didn't want their children to have a problem with the same issue as we grew up.
And as I shared in our introduction, both of your parents practiced medicine. How did they serve the community that became your new home?
You mean, how did they serve community in the United States?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
Yeah, so they were the first physicians to take care of the Russian emigres from the last wave in Chicago. So they basically helped their own kind of people from the same neighborhood. They saw other patients, of course, but at least half the practice was Russian emigres.
Was there a shortage of service to Russian emigres at that time?
I think there was. The other part is they understood the culture and they understood the language. It's much easier to take care of patients if you understand where they come from.
Absolutely. Was there any type of discrimination against Russian emigres at the time?
I don't think so. I mean, not that I perceived when I was 14 years old. And then still, like, for example, when I was in school, people made fun of me because of my accent. And I didn't quite understand what was going on because I didn't understand the culture. So I don't know if it was... Also, changing culture at 14 years old is not something I would highly recommend for entertainment. But I don't think there was discrimination per se, but, certainly anybody who's different, people make fun of, and I certainly had plenty of that happen.
Now, what were your aspirations when you entered medicine?
Well, actually, my plan was both of my parents were physicians. My father was a surgeon, and my mother was a primary care and endocrinologist. So my plan was to join their practice and kind of take over for my father to be a surgeon and for my brother to be an internist. So that was kind of my plan.
And how did that plan change?
Well, my mother killed herself when I was an intern at the surgical residency. So I left surgical residency at that time, and my mother died, obviously. And then my father was depressed. He really couldn't really practice medicine particularly well. And so it splintered our family, and certainly we didn't have a joint practice anymore. So I had to come up with a whole new plan. So since I really didn't have, I was not my best mental shape after that. So I left surgery and I went to anesthesia, and I did a training in anesthesia. As much as I liked that, what I missed there is patient care, because if you put people to sleep, wake them up, you really don't have a relationship with patients. And then I really missed that, and that's why I got into pain medicine, because there is a connection there.
So you, your father, and your brother all had the trauma of losing your mother in that horrible way.
Absolutely.
Is that something that you have dealt with yourself?
Oh, very much so. I had the treatment that I've started doing, stellate ganglion block for that, and I also had 3 years of psychotherapy.
And how did that shape or affect your desire to go into this work?
You mean using stellate ganglion block to do PTSD?
Yes, exactly.
Well, keep in mind, this is not the only trauma I've had. So I got hit by a propeller blade when I was a senior medical student.
Oh.
And I had lost half my blood volume. So, that was quite an interesting occurrence. And then my mother's death, of course, was horrible. So, but all of those traumas had made me very cognizant of limitation of psychiatry and psychology. And I definitely has persevered against significant amount of odds. This has been a very challenging road, trying to get stellate ganglion block to be accepted as a therapeutic modality for PTSD.
Now, what are some of the causes of PTSD that we are aware of here, and how have the events of 2020 contributed to increased cases?
Well, first of all, let's talk about what PTSD is and what it's not, if you don't mind.
Certainly.
I'll tell my perspective of it. So PTSD is just one of many terms that has been used to describe post-trauma mental dysfunction. The original term was soldier's heart during Civil War. Then it was battle fatigue in World War II, shell shock, World War I, and now PTSD. So the term that I personally like is PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury, which was a term coined by Dr. Frank Albert, the same psychiatrist that termed Stockholm Syndrome. And basically it signifies that there is a biological change in the brain. And then when people say PTSD is an invisible wound, my answer to that, it's invisible if you have the wrong scanner. If you have the right scanner, then you'll be able to actually see the brain change on MRI, functional MRI. And then as far as the causes of PTSD, anything that's an extended trauma or severe trauma or both can lead to it. So if you think what PTSD is, from my perspective, is when you have too much stress, too much trauma, it activates sympathetic fibers, fight or flight fibers, and it gets stuck on that position. And as long as that's persistent, people have the symptoms. They could be military action, it could be sexual assault, it could be near-death experience, loss of a loved one, like my mother's death, and things like that. But as far as 2020, there have been a number of factors which actually has increased a baseline stress of people, such as COVID, and potentially leading to death and fear, potential economic fallout, the social, political uncertainty of the election that has been extremely stressful, no matter which side of the aisle you're on. all of that has contributed to baseline anxiety and fear. So when people are watching hours and hours of TV, or they get social media that scares them, that increases their risk of PTSD. So somebody already had been traumatized. Now that trauma exacerbated what's going on.
Now, prior to this year, 2020, how many cases of PTSI, as you say, had been reported in the United States on an annual basis?
I think it depends who you read. It depends how you define it and things like that. So I would say at the most optimistic view, 8 to 10% of people have PTSD. But if you look at certain sectors of people, such as women, so 1 out of 3 women have a sexual attack in their lifetime. That's been published and probably underreported. So if that happens, then 50% of women who had sexual trauma will develop PTSD. So that's 1 out of 6 women. So the numbers are horrible. I would say I've seen numbers as low as 10% up to 30% of first responders, such as police, firefighters, ambulance drivers, things like that. And then childhood abuse is unfortunately extremely prevalent. And with COVID and restriction, that's actually going up. So, and then the other part, which I recently have been actually looking at in detail, is called election trauma disorder, which is this was coined in 2016, and I would say arguably 2016 election was not as aggressively fought as 2020. So at that time, the report was 25% of college students develop PTSD just from the stress of the election. So I think the numbers we're going to look at, we're talking about a viral pandemic currently. There's going to be a mental pandemic, which will be amazingly high. I'm probably looking at maybe as high as 40% of people may develop it, which would be horrific. The other thing to remember is that PTSD or PTSI will have a significant effect in the body, such as people with PTSD or PTSI, chance of having a heart attack is twice as high compared to people who are similar age without PTSD.
Are there those who are more prone to this? I'm not talking about first responders now, but the average population. Are there those who are more, what makes them more prone?
That's a tremendous question, actually. So if you look at the new science of epigenetics, basically epigenetics basically talks about a DNA change secondary to environment without mutation, meaning if you have, for example, just to look at my family, my grandfather was almost killed during pogroms in Russia. He had a genetic change from that, which he gave it to my father. And my father was a survivor. Out of 10,000 people in his squadron, 100 people made it. So he got PTSD from that. And now he passed on those genes. So the gene controls I actually wrote a paper on this. It's called NGF, nerve growth factor. So somebody who had trauma in their past from their relatives, their brain, the fibers, fight and flight fibers, are more responsive to trauma, and they're more likely to grow new fibers and more chance of PTSD. So they have been, if you look at some literature, they talk about people, for example, if you take 2 SEALs, the elite military force, one had a normal childhood, another one had a horrible childhood. The one with a horrible childhood will have a much higher chance of developing PTSD compared to somebody who had a normal childhood.
That's fascinating. Does the parent that's affected matter? In other words, is it both sides of the family, the male and the female side?
Oh yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't sit on X or Y. It sits on somatic Yeah, no, it does not.
And if both parents, X and Y, have had trauma in their lives, does that increase what happens to the child?
Frankly, I don't know. Theoretically, it will, but I don't know that.
Okay. You talked about being able to scan and see PTSI in a brain. What is the actual physical mechanism? What happens in the brain?
Yeah, so basically, let's talk about functional MRI, which is one of the ways to analyze the brain function, which is an amazing time for us to be alive since we actually see what happens. So if somebody has PTSD and one shows them a picture that's scary, amygdala, which is a part of the brain that controls the fear response, becomes overactivated. So you can actually see part of the brain light up more compared to somebody who does not. And that's how you can tell who has it and who doesn't.
And what's actually happening within the brain that causes that to happen?
Let's see if I can explain it better. So amygdala is a part of the brain that receives the messages, and let's look at it differently. So let's say antelope is out in the prairie, and it hears a little twig has a noise, right? And so that goes from the ear to the part of the brain that controls perception of the sound, and then part of that brain communicates to amygdala, and once that activates, the brain says somebody's going to eat me, and that leads to the body to go into overdrive and start running. So once the amygdala is activated, the sympathetic and fight-or-flight system is activated, the body goes into overgear and starts running. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So if you were looking at one of these special MRI scans, what would it appear like?
It lights up. A lot of times, you can put any color on it, but a lot of times people put it as high activity is red and low activity is blue. And then you can actually, if you look at brain scans, functional MRI scan or PET scans, you can see different parts of the brain lighting up different colors. And what that actually is telling you is if part of the brain is active or inactive. So, for example, there have been multiple studies by now. If you're doing a mathematical equation, a certain part of the brain lights up. If you are afraid, a different part lights up. If you're having an orgasm, a different part lights up, and so on.
So consequently, we're able to actually see in the MRI, in that special MRI that you just talked about, when someone is going through PTSI.
Correct. Actually,
being triggered by events that lead to the PTSI.
Right. Well, it's also until somebody's brain may look normal in the first scan, but then you show a scary picture and that activates it in a different way compared to somebody who does not have PTSI.
A triggering effect of some type.
Correct.
Okay. In the past, prior to the Stellate Ganglion procedure, what was the traditional treatment for PTSI?
Well, conventional therapy currently is pharmaceuticals and psychological talk therapy. Those are the two main ones. That's gold standard in the VA still.
And the pharmaceuticals, what do they actually do?
Well, I would say not that much.
Yeah.
But let me tell you what they're supposed to do. It depends. There are multiple classes of compounds. And then they basically are tranquilizers. So they calm people down and they can increase serotonin, make them feel happier. And then also it'll calm people down so they're not as responsive to the stimuli. So instead of being overreactive when they see a traumatic event or see something, they will stay calm during that. I think that's one of the big things. And also, PTSD is very linked with depression. So antidepressants are used very commonly for PTSD and associated depression.
So in essence, what the pharmaceuticals are doing are basically just calming the situation. They're not really remedying the situation.
Depends how you define remedy. But I think, basically, yeah. So if you take those pills for 30, 40 years, and if you can stay calm and it works, that'd be great. Unfortunately, a lot of times it doesn't work enough, and certainly that doesn't work quickly.
His name is Dr. Eugene Lipov. Dr. Lipov, please tell our listeners where they can find out more about you and your work.
If you go to eraseptsdnow.org, that's our non-for-profit, or stellacenter.com, which has a lot of information and the centers that are able to administer this procedure.
And we'll be back with more of Dr. Lipov after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
The best of the holistic, spiritual, and conscious world. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization. Their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
A social distancing tip.
Putting distance between yourself and others is critical to slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are ways to stay in contact without the physical contact part. Call, send a text, set up a video conference, post on social media, dedicate a song on the radio. If you have symptoms of fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going to their office. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Imagine yourself being transported to India, to the banks of the Ganga and an ashram in Rishikesh. Visualize that you are welcome to satsang with an American sannyasi who shares the wisdom of her guru. Your visualization has manifested. Join Sattvi Bhagawati Saraswati for inspiration and transformation every Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio.
Hello, I'm Sandy Sedgbeer, host of OMTimes Magazine's flagship radio show, What is Going On? My passion is sifting through information, research, and innovations from New Thought teachers, speakers, and researchers pushing back the boundaries of what we know about life, energy, metaphysics, and the universe. I love shifting perceptions about who we are, why we're here, and how quickly impossible becomes normal when we open our minds, expand our awareness, and accept that the only limits that exist are those we place upon ourselves. So if you're the kind of forward-thinking, eager investigator of what lies beyond the current reality that most perceive, why not make a date to come play with me in the field of possibilities at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time every Thursday, and together we can discover what's really going on.
Know that feeling? Like every door is closing and you just can't see a way out? Being unemployed, underemployed, or just out of school can feel like that. But when you find the right tools, suddenly everything just clicks. FindSomethingNew.org offers resources that help develop new skills that can position you for careers in today's growing industries, from healthcare and manufacturing to cybersecurity and alternative energy. Find your path to a new career at FindSomethingNew.org. A message from the Ad Council.
Hi, this is David Strickle. I'm excited to share my brand new show, The Stream of David Live, right here on OMTimes Radio. Each week I'll have exciting guests and I'll channel the eternal wisdom of the stream, a group of non-physical entities whose teachings have transformed lives all over the world. So join us for an uplifting hour each Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. That's The Stream of David Live right here on OMTimes Radio.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Dr. Eugene Lipov. So, what is the Stellate Ganglion procedure, and how does it work?
Yeah, so basically, as we talked before, what happens in PTSD, in order to understand how it works, I have to kind of review what PTSI is and what it's not. So, it's a biological change in the brain. So, when severe trauma occurs, new nerve fibers grow in the brain, fight and flight fibers grow in the brain. That's called sprouting. And that growth is controlled by a substance called NGF, nerve growth factor. Nerve growth factor is produced in the brain, and it travels from the brain interestingly enough, to the neck, where there's a clump of nerves called stellate ganglia, which controls the fight and flight nerves that go to the brain. So as long as that's maintained, people will have PTSD symptoms because the new nerves which grow in the brain, sympathetic nerves, produce something called norepinephrine. So if somebody takes a fluid around the brain in an experimental subject, norepinephrine levels could be twice as high as normal. And that leads to hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, and so on. So when a needle is placed or local anesthetic is placed in the base of the neck, and we numb up the ganglia, it seems to turn off the NGF, a nerve growth factor, and that leads to reversal of the extra nerve fibers, and that's called pruning, and that can reverse the trauma rapidly. And the effect can last months or years.
And how long does that procedure take?
5-7 minutes, typically.
So it's done on an outpatient basis?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay.
So, for example, I did 8 this morning.
Wow. That's pretty amazing. And what is the efficacy, the rate of success?
That it depends how you do it, because we have been improving it, and then one of the other gentlemen who does a lot of stellate ganglia block, Dr. Mulvaney, has also been improving it, and then we're looking at 80-85%, maybe as high as 90% success, depending on the technique.
And the length of time that the success lasts, is it permanent for some people?
Well, there's nothing permanent in this space because it depends on if somebody has previous trauma and then maybe repeat of trauma. It also depends on their biology or genetics. Average amount of time the first block can last is a few months to a year. The second one can last forever, as far as I know. The longest outlier so far, the first patient treated from the military with PTSD was 14 years ago. He's still doing very well. This has been 14 years.
And when we say doing very well, we're talking about no need for any type of pharmaceutical, no need for any type of therapy.
I think he does some therapy, but no pharmaceuticals, no admissions to the hospital. Keep in mind, this particular gentleman, I met him because he had to shoot a 10-year-old child in Iraq, and this child was laden explosive sent to take out his quad, so his child hit him. It was horrible. He came home. He tried to strangle his wife a few times. It was disastrous. He's still married to the same woman. As far as I know, they're doing well.
Wonderful. Is SGP a relatively new procedure?
No, actually, the first time stellate ganglion block, SGB actually, stellate ganglion block, was done was 1925. My father was born in 1925. It was done for asthma, actually. And then people have been doing it for arm pain and headaches since then. The first time I personally did stellate ganglion block was 1987 for arm pain.
And so it had been used for pain reduction or relief, but in terms of use for PTSI, when was the first time this was used?
The first time it was done was 2006, and the first article written about it was by me in 2008.
So you pioneered this procedure for this purpose?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Did you receive any resistance, just out of curiosity at the time? Or still?
Both, all of the above. Well, keep in mind, to be fair, it's like the first time I was on TV talking about it, people, a doctor was interviewing me. He said, all right, shot in the neck, why does it do anything in the brain? Tell me how that all works. So frankly, I had no idea how it worked particularly until I wrote a paper about it in 2009. I knew it worked. I was able to predict it based on other papers from Finland where they were doing something similar. But, they have been resistant for that. I think there is much less resistance because a number of people have replicated it. I would say, and it's the pure guess, about 4,000 military personnel have been treated using this procedure, primarily special operators. But it's still kind of, credulity is still our problem. It's hard to believe something that's been around that long could be used for this purpose. And I've had a lot of my colleagues actually say, it's like, this block has been used since 1925. You're just not that smart. Why you as opposed to anybody else? Why did you figure it out, right? And why would a shot in the neck do anything psychiatric at all?
And what's your answer to that?
Well, first of all, my answer is, there isn't me, because I was trying to, if you'd like, I can tell you how it came about, why it was ever done.
Please, yes.
I think it's an interesting story, educational for me at least. So I call it the para-anesthetic use of Stellate, meaning outside the normal use. So I had a patient that had severe neck pain, which I treated, and then she also had hot flashes. So I sent her to my brother, who's an internist, and I said, please take care of the hot flashes. So he wasn't able to do it, whatever the reason. She wasn't responsive to normal methods. So I sent her back and said, why don't you do Stellate? Because, people have burning hands, hot flashes everywhere burning. It should work. Being an anesthesiologist, I knew it would not work. But he, being internist, thought, try it. Patient was okay with it. We tried it. It worked great. So then I had a newspaper article written about me. And I was starting to get really good results. So I knew I was in trouble, and the first line said, Bianca Kennedy, this beautiful breast cancer survivor, was so desperate to have Dr. Lipov relieve her hot flashes, she let him plunge a needle into her neck. And went downhill from there. So the main problem that the chairman of the department at that time had, he said, yes, it seems to be working, but you don't know how it works, so we don't want anything to do with it. So that led me to reading 3,000 articles about anything and everything regarding unique use of Stellate or sympathetics. I found an article from Finland where they were doing clipping in the chest of sympathetic ganglion, again, fight and flight, to take away hand sweating. And they saw PTSD relief. So then I was like, well, that's weird. That makes no sense. Then I looked at the anatomy. It turns out the chain in the chest becomes stellate ganglion in the neck and goes up to the brain. So once I realized that, I called up my brother again. I said, if you have PTSD patients, send it to me. Maybe I can help them. And he was able to find somebody like that. We treated them. That's what led to the first paper.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
Crazy.
Does this also work for generic pain in other parts of the body?
Well, primarily, it seems to work for headaches. It works for CRPS, complex regional pain syndrome. It has some other odd effects. It may help pelvic pain. We've used it for that. But frankly, I have not really explored that for other type of pain. It could be used for shingles. It's quite well for shingles in the face. But those are the pretty conventional therapeutics.
Now, you had mentioned a couple of cases that you talked about. Do you have a couple of other cases that you can share with our audience?
Well, absolutely. I'll tell you, yeah, sure. So there was one young lady, very unfortunate story. I think had a good ending. But she was molested at 6 years old. Then she was fighting in school. It was terrible. At 12 years old, her mother brought her to me, and we treated her, and she did really well. She was able to go to work, go to school, and she was very highly functional. And then she came back a year later. And we thought, well, the block wore out. So after we did the block, she did really well. Turned out somebody tried to abduct her in a shopping mall. Mm. So what that story actually signifies, A, we've used it in children, and it seemed to have worked well in children, thank God. B, that if somebody has another stress or trauma, it can reignite PTSD again. Mm. Right? So that I think that's important. The other story we had was a very lovely young lady who was working as a nurse in the Army, and then there was a civilian employee that was really giving her a hard time. So he torched her. I think she lost maybe 30-50% of her skin. So she had severe PTSD, and that was one of the hardest things for me to do technically because the skin was so tough on her neck. So we did a couple of blocks on her. She did really well. And the last one, actually, that I want to bring up is we had a gentleman that was falsely accused of a horrible crime. He was placed in jail in Ohio for 12 years in almost solitary confinement. He gets released from jail based on DNA evidence, and they found the real killer. But he came out severe PTSD. He gave PTSD to his wife, and that's called secondary PTSD. We treated both of them, and they both did really well.
That's wonderful. You had mentioned before we started the segment offline, we were talking about my personal experience. Are there some people who have natural immunity to this?
Some people, yes. So there was actually, in my lectures, actually, I've run across some amazing psychiatrists who've done work with special operators or like SEALs, Delta Force, and things like that. And there are certain people, there seem to be people who are resistant to developing PTSD no matter the trauma, which is pretty crazy. And there was some research on peptide Y, which is a part of the brain that seems to give people resilience, like natural resilience. People who have difficult childhoods and there is a lot of problems, that seems to not, that definitely is not protective. But if somebody has high peptide Y and have a particularly good childhood, potentially they could be very resilient and not develop PTSD. But, you know, there's only so much you can do to a human being until they do develop it.
Are there any side effects from SGB?
Absolutely. Fortunately, they're rare. But there was the only big study that looked at side effects was done in Germany in 1992. This is before X-ray guidance or ultrasound guidance. So they did 45,000 blocks in country of Germany. And then there was 11 seizures because they injected the local anesthetic in the wrong area. They hit a blood vessel. And they had pneumothorax, I think, in 9 people, which is air in the lung, and they had a couple of allergic reactions. There was no fatalities, thankfully. It should be safer now because we're using, I did 30 years of X-ray guidance, and then we moved on to ultrasound guidance now. It took me a while to switch over, but I'm really liking that new technique because you can see the blood vessels, you can see the lungs, you can see where the bones are. So it's even safer at this point.
And will SGB work for everyone suffering from PTSD?
There's nothing in medicine that's 100%. There is still failures. In fact, there was a gentleman that I treated a month ago. He had a perfect neck. We did the injection perfectly. He had something called Horner syndrome or droopy eyelid. It was perfect. Then we switched to the other side. Everything was perfect. Nothing. It did absolutely nothing. And then, in fact, I have some new ideas how to potentially treat people who did not respond. But I would say 7 to 9% of people will not respond at all to this treatment.
And what has your research shown about that resistance?
I just have guesses. The problem is, we need to do studies that actually led. So the bottom line is I don't know. But that's why we are talking to a major institution about doing a study. In fact, if anybody could, we are trying to raise funds to give to the institution, which at the end of the day, hopefully will show what actually happens in the brain in great detail. And then we can figure out who the non-responders are and why that happens.
And you had mentioned a not-for-profit that you have. Is that engaged in this fundraising?
Yes, sir.
And what is that?
No.
Please share that with us.
Yeah. Thank you. It's called eraseptsdnow.org.
And people can go to that site and they can make donations to help the research on this work.
Not only that, we're looking for a few things. We'd like to have the nation this work. I mean, we're looking for the study. We're looking for $3.5 million. So we're looking for big donation there. But if people can do small donations, they can help us treat various cohorts, such as military, such as abused women. We're also starting to do urban or underserved areas, PTSD, all of that. So we're very interested in treating. Unfortunately, trauma doesn't seem to care where it comes from.
Yeah.
Trauma affects the brain. People develop PTSD. In fact, one of the gentlemen I treated from Englewood, he's a boxer from there. He developed PTSD because the first time he saw somebody killed, not the last, he was 8 years old, and somebody's throat was slit in front of him. Oh. So he was treated, and he did great. And then I treated another gentleman the same day from Iraq, and they both were standing together. They were laughing, and they said, so the boxer was saying to the veterans that, hey, you survived the Iraq War, I survived the war in Englewood.
Mm. Absolutely. My guest is Dr. Eugene Lipov. We'll be back with more of him after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
Ascending Hearts is no ordinary dating site, but a spiritual dating site with a purpose, to link you with your soulmate. We engineer the serendipity so you can trust that you will attune with someone that has the same matching vibration as you. Ascending Hearts, the conscious dating site for the spiritually aware. Try Ascending Hearts for free. AscendingHearts.com.
Hi, we're the Goo Goo Dolls. We're fortunate that we can give our daughters everything they need to grow and learn. But not every child can focus on classes and play dates.
Nearly 13 million kids in the U.S. face hunger. That's 1 in 6. School lunch might be their only meal each day, and it's heartbreaking to imagine any child going to bed hungry. We're dreaming of a perfect day when kids can smile, play, and just be kids without worrying about where their next meal will come from. Feeding America is working to make that perfect day a reality.
Each year, the Feeding America network of food banks rescues billions of pounds of good food that would have gone to waste. That food is given to families and children in need. Being a kid should be about doing things that make an ordinary day extraordinary. Learning to play an instrument, building a sandcastle, hosting tea parties. Hunger should never be an obstacle to growing up.
You can help end childhood hunger in your community by visiting feedingamerica.org.
Brought to you by Feeding America and the Ad Council.
I love this song! I love nachos.
Loving everything? You might be buzzed.
You know what I'd love? A ride when it's time to head out.
If you see a buzz warning sign, call for a ride when it's time to go home. Buzz driving is drunk driving. A message from NHTSA and the Ad Council.
Hello, I'm Lisa Berry. Join me every Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for Light on Living. A chance to see new, hear different, and feel more as I shine the spotlight on all the ways to lighten the load of life's challenges. Light on Living is your link to that new way you're looking for, that new understanding that will enhance your life, and that positive connection that will support your growth. So join me, and you'll gain insight and start to see things in a new way that motivates you.
Vox Novus, the new voice. Vox Novus, the new dimension. Vox Novus, thought and movement leaders who will share from their experience and offer tools to help us navigate our rapidly changing world. My name is Victor Fuhrman. Join me every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern on OMTimes Radio for Vox Novus, the new voice.
So I'm a cat, and I just moved in with this new human, and she's got this little toy she's always playing with, all day long. Tap, 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 bloop, bloop. She can't put it down. There it is. Oh, and get this. She even talks to it. Last week, she asked it for Chinese, and guess what? Egg rolls showed up. Like magic. Humans have cool toys.
A person is the best thing to happen to a shelter pet. Be that person. Adopt. Brought to you by the Ad Council and the ShelterPetProject.org.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions, but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Hi, this is Bill Maher. I can find humor in almost anything, but one thing I never laugh about is cruelty to animals. If you don't get the joke either, write People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, 501 Front Street, Norfolk, Virginia, 23510.
More than 24 million Americans have an autoimmune disorder, and that number continues to grow. I'm Sharon Saylor, and I'm one of those 24 million. To put that number in perspective, cancer affects about 9 million and heart disease up to 22 million. That's why I've brought together top experts and those thriving regardless of their diagnosis to bring you the latest, most up-to-date information. Join me, Sharon Saylor, Friday night, 7 p.m. Eastern, for the Autoimmune Hour on Life Interrupted Radio to find out how to live your life uninterrupted.
Grab a cup of tea or a glass of wine and tune in for Inspired Conversations with publisher Linda Joy on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern. Linda creates sacred space for leading female luminaries, empowering authors, heart-centered female entrepreneurs, coaches, and healers. A soulful venue where guests openly share the fears and obstacles they've overcome, wisdom and lessons learned, and the personal journey that led them to the transformational work they do in the world. Inspired Conversations to empower you on your path to authentic, soulful living.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week is Dr. Eugene Lipov. Let me ask you this question. What is with the effect of this year's election cycle, so-called fake news, social networking media, has that had an effect on our stress levels and made this spawn PTSI?
I believe that's true, yes. So the term was introduced in 2016, election stress disorder. So the fake news, social media, the aggressive campaigning, all of that definitely increases stress, and that leads to the chance of developing PTSI.
And what about people's reliance on social media for their information?
I think it's very dangerous, personally. So my recommendation has been and still is to minimize the amount of exposure to that, to maybe 30 minutes per day, and not jump every time it tweaks, peeps, or bumps, whatever the phone does. You know, if you can limit the amount of time you look at the media exposure, that would be markedly helpful to maintain brain status, stay calm, and not get overly stressed.
And what advice would you offer our listeners, in addition to those tips, to prevent PTSD or PTSI in our current climate? Do you have some techniques that you suggest?
Absolutely. Meditation is very important. Meditation is the only thing that's been shown to grow brain tissue back. Exercise, even running in place, is very helpful, produce endorphins. And then, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So exercise is really good. Yoga is amazing because it increases vagal tone, which is opposite of fight and flight. So if you can do yoga, it will calm the body down. You can recover quicker. You can stay calm. And then also eating well, minimize the amount of alcohol, stretching, all of those things are very helpful.
Any special diet with the eating?
Anything that's not overactivating. So I wouldn't drink a lot of coffee, maybe having chamomile tea. Having a regular sleep cycle is very important. I'm not a nutritionist, but the key point is I would reduce the amount of red meat and definitely coffee. Those are two things I think keeps your body revved up. That's not a good thing.
Tell us more about sleep quality.
So if you think about what sleep does, during sleep you kind of reorganize your brain. You can put everything where it needs to be, and you can wake up refreshed. While if you have all the devices going, all the light reduces your sleep, obviously. It also reduces something called melatonin. People have heard about melatonin. It's a natural substance that's produced at night. So if you suppress that, then you don't sleep well. Also, you need melatonin for the body to recover. So it's really important to have regular sleep time, minimize amount of TV, minimize amount of light. All of that is really important because, again, your recovery is much quicker and better.
Now, you had mentioned something that I'd never heard of before, and that meditation can actually promote the growth of brain tissue. How does that work?
Frankly, I really don't quite understand it. I don't have enough neuroscience background, but it has been shown on MRI scans that the thickness of cortex gets bigger. And what happens is when you meditate, the nerve connections increase. So you get more complexity of your brain, and that's why it's get thicker. Now, exact nitty-gritty, I really don't know.
And to that extent, our listeners primarily practice yoga and meditate on a regular basis. Is there any indication as to how often someone should meditate to derive the best benefits?
At least 15 to 30 minutes per day. In the morning, not in the evening. In fact, I use a machine that may be helpful for you listeners. So it's called Muse, M-U-S-E, and it uses EEG biofeedback to meditate. What's interesting is that when I try to do it at night, I can see when I fall asleep, the EEG goes crazy. And when I do it in the morning and I have control of my brain, it goes to a much more relaxed state.
Wonderful. So 15 to 30 minutes a day of meditation are very effective.
Absolutely. I think that's key. And you need to be consistent.
What would you share with our valiant first responders to diffuse stress and prevent PTSD?
I think the same thing. Meditate, take care of yourself, eat well. The other thing is people don't realize how effective hugs are. Unfortunately, during the time of COVID, you don't want to have too many hugging going on. But it produces oxytocin. Oxytocin actually reduces fight and flight system activation. So one other thing that my wife and I like to do is Skype dinners. So we stay connected with our friends and family via Skype. So we make dinner and they make dinner and then we talk to each other. You need a human interaction. The more of that you do, the better off you'll do through this horrible, difficult time.
Are cyber hugs effective?
I guess. I don't.
So you're saying the physical act of hugging is what produces the oxytocin?
You need that, but social connection is producing some. So, again, I'm not a oxytocin expert.
Okay.
But I would say just the mere fact that you're interacting with somebody, you're not alone. Being alone is very debilitating for a human because we are social animals.
Absolutely. And we talked about first responders and also those folks who are working the front line of COVID in the hospitals, the doctors, the nurses, all the staff in the hospitals who are so stressed and at their maximum peak right now. Are there other suggestions or techniques you can offer for them?
Well, I am a physician. I work in a hospital. I think the key point is to be supportive of each other and stay patient with each other. Because it's very hard to maintain and even kill when you see people. When you lose people, I think it's very disruptive. And I think finding solace in your friends is crucial. When I used to be a trauma surgeon, we certainly lost plenty of people who were being shot and killed all type of different ways. And at least the weekly meetings with my friends gave me a chance to recharge and recoup.
I was going to say, did they offer what we used to call in ministry diffusing sessions after you've done heavy-duty counseling? Like after 9/11, we were doing chaplaincy and counseling, and they had these wonderful sessions where we could sit down and share our feelings with each other, so we would be reducing the amount of stress that we might be taking from the experience.
I don't know. I don't think so. But I'm not sure. I'm not in that space anymore.
Okay. Is there a message that you would like to share with our listeners? Some final thought?
Well, I have a few. One is PTSD is real. It exists. So there should be no stigma attached to it. We can actually measure it. So if you have PTSD, please get treated as soon as you can. A lot of PTSD can be resolved with cognitive behavior therapy and basically good interaction with people. Sometimes pharmaceuticals are helpful. Stellate ganglion blocks can definitely help a large number of people, but nothing works for everyone. And then if you can support my work so we can treat more people from various cohorts, if you can go into eraseptsdnow.org, that would be great. You can also look up stellacenter.com, where we are trying to develop a network of physicians who can deliver those services to the people who need them.
Dr. Lipov, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this wonderful work that you do.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor, the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.